Topic: the Vietnam War. The battle for ideology and the consequences of U.S. intervention. Did you know that the Vietnam War changed the way America views war and intervention forever? Over 58,000 American soldiers died, while the conflict left over 3 million Vietnamese dead. It wasn't just a war, it was an ideological battle that impacted not just Southeast Asia, but also the global political landscape. In this video, we'll explore the causes, battles, and consequences of the Vietnam War, and why it continues to shape our world today. Welcome to our channel. Today, we're diving deep into the Vietnam War, a conflict that marked one of the most turbulent chapters in modern history. By the 1960s, the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a Cold War, a battle for global influence and the spread of ideologies. The Vietnam War, fought between communist North Vietnam, backed by the USSR and China, and the anti-communist South Vietnam, supported by the United States, became a key front in this ideological battle. Why did the U.S. intervene? How did a small Southeast Asian country become the focal point of a global conflict? And most importantly, what were the lasting consequences for both America and Vietnam? In the next 60 minutes, we will break down the Vietnam War's origins, the key events, the harrowing battles, the role of propaganda, the controversial decisions made by leaders, and of course, the aftermath that still echoes today. Part 1. The Roots of the Conflict, 301 to 700. Before we get to the war itself, we need to understand the roots of the conflict. Vietnam's colonial past. Vietnam was under French colonial rule for nearly a century. The French exploited the country's resources, creating economic inequality and social unrest. By the 1940s, the Vietnamese began to demand independence. The figurehead of this struggle was Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the Viet Minh, a communist resistance movement. The U.S. and France initially supported Ho Chi Minh's fight against the Japanese during World War II, but after the war they shifted allegiance to France as it sought to reassert control over its colonies. First Indochina War, 1946 to 1954. In 1946, after the Japanese surrendered, France tried to regain control over Vietnam. This triggered the First Indochina War, fought between the French and the Viet Minh. The French, with American financial and military support, couldn't hold back the growing nationalist movement. In 1954, after a crushing defeat at Dien Bien Phu, France agreed to the Geneva Accords, which temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, north controlled by Ho Chi Minh's communist government, and the south led by the pro-Western government of Ngo Dinh Diem. Part 2. The Cold War Context. The Domino Theory. The Vietnam War wasn't just a fight for control over a small country. It was a key battle in the broader Cold War. The United States believed in the domino theory, which claimed that if one country in Southeast Asia fell to communism, others would follow. This fear drove the U.S. to intervene in Vietnam to prevent the spread of communism across the region. The role of the U.S. and the Soviet Union. As the Cold War heated up, Vietnam became a proxy battleground. The Soviets and China supported the communist North, while the U.S. poured resources into the South, trying to stop the spread of communism. The U.S. provided South Vietnam with military equipment, funding, and eventually troops. This ideological showdown set the stage for one of the most devastating conflicts in modern history. Part 3. The American Involvement. The Gulf of Tonkin Incident, 1964. In 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred, which involved alleged attacks on U.S. Navy vessels by North Vietnamese forces. This led to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave President Lyndon B. Johnson the authority to escalate military action in Vietnam. This marked the official entry of the U.S. into full-scale combat. Escalation under Johnson, 1965 to 1968. In 1965, President Johnson decided to send ground troops to Vietnam. By 1968, the number of U.S. soldiers in Vietnam had ballooned to over 500,000. The U.S. launched extensive bombing campaigns and attempted to fight the war through conventional means, massive airstrikes, artillery, and large-scale ground operations. But the war wasn't conventional. U.S. versus guerrilla warfare. The Viet Cong, a group of communist fighters in the South, employed guerrilla tactics that left the U.S. military struggling. They were masters of ambushes, booby traps, and hit-and-run tactics. The dense jungles and lack of proper infrastructure made it nearly impossible for the U.S. military to defeat them using traditional strategies. Part 4. The Tet Offensive. The Turning Point. In 1968, the Tet Offensive marked a major turning point. During the Lunar New Year Tet, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong launched a surprise attack on over 100 cities, including Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. The U.S. and South Vietnamese forces repelled the attack, but the psychological impact was immense. It shattered American confidence in the war and revealed that victory was far from certain. Television's role. For the first time, Americans saw the brutal reality of the war on their television screens. Images of combat, suffering, and the devastation of cities broadcasted directly into American homes, fueling growing discontent and protests against the war. Part 5. The Anti-War Movement. The Rise of Protests. As the war dragged on, more and more Americans began to question the legitimacy of the war. Student protests, civil rights activists, and veterans became vocal opponents of the war. The 1969 Woodstock Festival became a symbol of counterculture and anti-war sentiment. People across the U.S. began to demand an end to the war, calling for peace and for the withdrawal of U.S. troops. The political impact. The public pressure forced President Johnson not to seek re-election in 1968. His successor, Richard Nixon, promised to bring peace with honor and began the process of Vietnamization, handing over the responsibility of fighting the war to the South Vietnamese while gradually withdrawing American troops. Part 6. The Paris Peace Accords. Negotiating peace. In 1973, after years of failed negotiations and continued fighting, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The agreement called for the withdrawal of U.S. troops, the return of prisoners of war, and a ceasefire between the North and South. However, the peace was fragile. The fall of Saigon, 1975. Despite the accords, the war didn't end. In 1975, the North Vietnamese launched a final offensive that led to the fall of Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. The U.S. evacuated its personnel and South Vietnam collapsed, marking the official end of the war. Vietnam was unified under communist rule. Part 7. The Aftermath and Legacy for the United States. The Vietnam War left the U.S. deeply scarred. Over 58,000 Americans lost their lives and many more returned home with severe physical and psychological wounds. The war caused a national crisis of trust. For years, the public had been told that victory was just around the corner, but the reality of defeat left many feeling betrayed by their government. For Vietnam, the war also devastated Vietnam. Over 3 million people died, and the country's infrastructure was destroyed. In the years that followed, Vietnam had to rebuild from the ashes while dealing with the legacy of war, landmines, and the psychological scars of its people. Part 8. Lessons learned. The impact on U.S. foreign policy. The Vietnam War changed the way the U.S. approaches foreign interventions. It led to the Vietnam Syndrome, a hesitancy to commit American forces to foreign conflicts. The war taught the world that ideological struggles cannot always be won by military force. Diplomacy, negotiation, and understanding of local dynamics became key lessons in the following decades. The end of the Cold War. While the Vietnam War itself was a tragedy, it also played a role in shaping the eventual end of the Cold War. The failure in Vietnam exposed the limits of military power and highlighted the importance of diplomacy in dealing with global conflicts. Part 9. The Legacy of Vietnam War in the United States and Vietnam. The U.S. fallout. The Vietnam War did not end when the last American troops left in 1973. The scars left by the war lingered far longer in the American psyche. The war shattered the sense of invincibility that many Americans had in the aftermath of World War II. It led to a profound distrust in government, especially as the public became more aware of the Pentagon Papers, a classified study revealing that U.S. officials had misled the public about the war's progress. The war also changed American military policy. The Vietnam Syndrome became a term used to describe the reluctance of the U.S. to engage in military interventions overseas, especially after the failures of Vietnam. The heavy loss of life, financial costs, and the failure to achieve a clear victory made future military leaders wary of getting involved in conflicts without clear objectives. This war left America deeply divided. Those who supported it felt betrayed by the public's retreat from their sacrifices, while those who opposed it believed the U.S. had no business intervening in another country's civil war. Psychological impact. The psychological toll of the Vietnam War on returning soldiers was immense. Many veterans returned home with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, a condition that was not widely understood at the time. The lack of support and the hostile reception from anti-war activists made it harder for veterans to reintegrate into society. The U.S. government took decades to recognize the full extent of these issues and establish veterans' health programs to help them cope. Moreover, Agent Orange, the toxic herbicide used by the U.S. military to clear dense jungle, caused long-term health issues for both Vietnamese civilians and American veterans. Thousands of veterans and Vietnamese civilians suffered from cancers, birth defects, and other life-threatening diseases as a result of exposure to the chemical. Vietnam War Memorial. In 1982, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was built in Washington, D.C., to honor those who served and died in the conflict. The black granite wall, engraved with the names of over 58,000 soldiers, became a national symbol of the pain, loss, and trauma suffered by the American public. It provided a space for healing, but it also stirred emotions over the unfinished business of the war. Part 10. The lasting impact of the Vietnam War in Vietnam. Post-war Vietnam. For Vietnam, the war was a devastating chapter in its history. The toll on the Vietnamese people was incalculable. An estimated 3 million Vietnamese, military personnel and civilians, died during the conflict. The country's infrastructure was destroyed, entire cities were leveled, and the human cost was staggering. After the war, Vietnam found itself deeply scarred, not just physically, but psychologically as well. It would take decades for the country to recover. Despite the North's victory and the reunification of Vietnam in 1975, the challenges that followed were immense. The newly unified country faced economic devastation, with much of its infrastructure destroyed. Additionally, the economic blockade imposed by the U.S. and its allies created further hardships. The government pursued a policy of economic collectivism that failed to revive the country's economy. The embargo on Vietnam was only lifted in the early 1990s, but by then, the scars of war had already taken a toll on its population. The reconciliation process. The journey towards reconciliation with the United States was slow and difficult. It wasn't until the 1990s that formal diplomatic relations were re-established between the two countries. In 1995, the U.S. and Vietnam fully normalized diplomatic relations, marking a significant shift in how the two countries viewed each other. Vietnam began to rebuild its relationships with the outside world and integrate itself into the global community. This shift was symbolized by the Vietnamese economic reforms under Doi Moi, a policy of market liberalization that spurred the country's economic growth. However, despite the official reconciliation, many older generations in Vietnam still carry the pain of losing loved ones during the war. The deep scars left by the conflict remain in the collective consciousness of the people, who continue to honor the fallen soldiers with memorials and ceremonies. Environmental damage and the legacy of war. In addition to the human toll, the Vietnam War left lasting environmental damage. The widespread use of Agent Orange, which was intended to strip away the jungle cover for the enemy, has had catastrophic long-term effects. Today, the consequences of the herbicide are still visible in the form of birth defects, cancer, and deformities. The United States has since provided some assistance in the cleanup of contaminated areas, but the damage remains irreversible. Conclusion: what can we learn from the Vietnam War? As we conclude this deep dive into the Vietnam War and its aftermath, one question lingers. What can we learn from this devastating conflict? The Vietnam War serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of military overreach, the importance of understanding the local culture, and the complexities of international interventions. For the United States, the Vietnam War marked the beginning of a more cautious approach to foreign intervention, leading to changes in both policy and public opinion. The war also led to changes in how the military approaches unconventional warfare, understanding that ideological battles cannot always be won through military force. For Vietnam, the war was a harsh journey of resilience and rebuilding. The country emerged from the conflict, unified but broken. Over the past few decades, Vietnam has steadily rebuilt itself into one of the fastest-growing economies in the world. Still, the long-term consequences of the war continue to affect its people. Final thoughts: the enduring echo of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War left an indelible mark on history. It reshaped the political landscape, both in the U.S. and Vietnam, and it influenced the world's approach to warfare and diplomacy. As we reflect on this conflict, it's important to remember the lessons learned so that we do not repeat the mistakes of the past. The Vietnam War. The battle for ideology and the consequences of U.S. intervention. Part 11. The cultural and global impact of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War wasn't just a battle fought on the ground. It was a battle fought for hearts and minds, both on the battlefield and in the cultural sphere. In this 11th part of our series, we'll look at how the Vietnam War influenced popular culture and shaped the political landscape, not just in America, but around the world. From the rise of anti-war movements to the way it was portrayed in films, music, and literature, the Vietnam War left a lasting imprint on global society and consciousness. But what did it mean for the people who lived through it? And how does its legacy still echo today? The rise of anti-war movements in the United States. As the Vietnam War dragged on, public opinion in the United States shifted dramatically. Once viewed as a necessary fight against the spread of communism, the war became increasingly seen as unwinnable, morally questionable, and disastrous. The horrific images broadcast on television and the increasing number of American casualties ignited a wave of protests and dissent across the country. The anti-war movement reached its peak in the late 1960s and early 1970s, with massive protests, sit-ins, and marches against the war. In 1969, nearly 500,000 people gathered for the moratorium to end the war in Vietnam in Washington, D.C. Meanwhile, college campuses became hotbeds of dissent, with students organizing protests and rallies calling for the immediate withdrawal of U.S. troops. The Kent State University shooting in 1970, in which 4 students were killed by National Guardsmen during an anti-war protest, became a symbol of the increasingly polarized state of American society during the war. The growing division between the government and the public, particularly the younger generation, illustrated the deepening political and cultural rift in the United States during the conflict. These protests weren't just about the war in Vietnam. They were about questioning authority, government transparency, and the very notion of American exceptionalism. The war and the opposition to it helped catalyze a larger counterculture movement that would redefine American values for years to come. The Vietnam War in popular culture, music, films, and literature. The Vietnam War deeply impacted American pop culture. Music, films, and literature from the era reflect the tension, anger, and confusion that dominated public sentiment as the conflict escalated. These cultural expressions became powerful ways to both document and criticize the war. In music, the anti-war movement found its most resonant voice. Songs like Give Peace a Chance by John Lennon, Fortunate Son by Creedence Clearwater Revival, and Where Have All the Flowers Gone by Pete Seeger all became anthems for the generation that opposed the war. These songs weren't just melodies, they were calls to action, urging people to stand up against the violence and the injustice of the war. In film, the Vietnam War became the subject of some of the most influential works of American cinema. Films like Apocalypse Now, 1979, directed by Francis Ford Coppola, and Platoon, 1986, directed by Oliver Stone, gave audiences a raw and unflinching view of the horrors of war. These films were not just about Vietnam. They were about the trauma that soldiers experienced and the psychological toll that war took on both soldiers and civilians. The movie Born on the 4th of July, 1989, starring Tom Cruise, portrayed the journey of Vietnam War veteran Ron Covett, who became an outspoken critic of the war after returning home. His personal transformation reflected the disillusionment many veterans faced as they came to terms with their participation in a war that they now viewed as unjust. In literature, books like The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien and Dispatches by Michael Herr captured the emotional and psychological toll that the Vietnam War had on soldiers. These works offered a deeply personal look at the war's impact on those who fought in it, giving voice to the silent suffering of veterans and the psychological scars they carried home. The Vietnam War's impact on American society. The Vietnam War changed American society in profound ways, affecting not just foreign policy but the very fabric of American culture. The war left deep scars on both the soldiers who fought in it and the civilian population that protested it. For veterans returning home, the war was often a silent burden. Many soldiers returned to a country that didn't want to talk about the war or acknowledge the sacrifice they had made. Unlike previous wars, Vietnam veterans were not welcomed back as heroes. Instead, they were often met with anger, indifference, or outright hostility. The psychological toll of the war, particularly in the form of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, became a major issue, but it was a problem that wasn't fully understood or addressed at the time. For civilians, the war created a crisis of faith in the American government. The Pentagon Papers, a classified government study that revealed the U.S. had misled the public about the progress of the war, further eroded trust in government institutions. This contributed to the broader cultural shift of the 1960s and 1970s, which saw a decline in traditional authority and a rise in skepticism towards political leaders. Politically, the war influenced the rise of the New Left, which advocated for social justice and civil rights, and was critical of American imperialism. On the other side, the war also gave rise to the silent majority, a term coined by President Richard Nixon, which represented Americans who supported the war and were tired of the protests and unrest. This split in the American public paved the way for new political movements in the 1970s, the global legacy of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War's effects weren't confined to America. It had far-reaching consequences across the world, particularly in Southeast Asia. The war resulted in the death and displacement of millions of people in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. After the fall of Saigon in 1975, Vietnam was reunited under a communist government, but the country was left in ruins. The Vietnam War also had significant effects on U.S. foreign policy. The experience of Vietnam led to what is known as the Vietnam Syndrome, the fear of becoming entangled in another foreign conflict without clear objectives or the support of the American people. This would have lasting implications on U.S. foreign policy for decades, particularly during conflicts like the Gulf War and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. For the Soviet Union, the war was a symbol of America's vulnerability. While the Soviet Union was not directly involved in the conflict, they supported North Vietnam with military aid. The war's outcome showed that even a superpower like the U.S. could be defeated in a protracted war. This knowledge would influence Soviet actions in Afghanistan in the 1980s, a war that would ultimately contribute to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Across the world, the Vietnam War became a symbol of resistance to imperialism. It inspired many revolutionary movements, particularly in the Third World, where leaders saw Vietnam as proof that a small, determined nation could defeat a global superpower. The war's aftermath saw the rise of new communist and anti-colonial movements in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Vietnam. War veterans, the silent heroes. The legacy of the Vietnam War is incomplete without acknowledging the experiences of the veterans who fought in it. Many returned home to a society that didn't understand or appreciate what they had gone through. The psychological wounds of the war, particularly PTSD, were often overlooked. Veterans faced a long battle not only with their inner demons, but also with a society that didn't know how to process the trauma. It wasn't until the 1980s, with the establishment of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., that the country began to acknowledge the sacrifices made by those who served. The memorial, with its stark, black granite wall inscribed with the names of over 58,000 American soldiers who died or went missing in Vietnam, became a powerful symbol of healing and remembrance. The Vietnam War is a chapter of American and global history that continues to shape our world today. From its cultural impact on music, film, and literature to its lasting effects on American society and foreign policy, the war left an indelible mark. It remains a powerful reminder of the dangers of escalating conflicts, the importance of public trust, and the complex realities of military intervention. The scars of the Vietnam War are still felt today by those who lived through it, whether they were soldiers, protesters, or civilians. As we look at conflicts around the world today, it's impossible to ignore the lessons of Vietnam. Could history repeat itself? And if so, will we be ready to learn from the past? What do you think? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Conclusion. Continued. The long shadow of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War continues to echo in the way we approach foreign policy, military intervention, and how we understand the complex relationship between a government and its people. The fear of becoming mired in another quagmire like Vietnam remains a prominent consideration for American leaders when deciding on military action in foreign conflicts. Today's wars, particularly in places like the Middle East, continue to bring up comparisons with Vietnam, especially in the context of asymmetric warfare, where conventional military power is often ineffective against guerrilla tactics and insurgent forces. For the veterans of Vietnam, their battle didn't end when they returned home. Many struggled with reintegration into society, dealing with PTSD, physical injuries, and the stigma that came with being part of a controversial war. The fight for recognition and compensation, as well as for the proper care of veterans, became another long battle they had to face after the war was over. The Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C. serves as a powerful symbol of remembrance for those who sacrificed their lives, as well as for the countless others who experienced the war in different ways. It's a place of reflection, not just for the U.S., but for the world to pause and think about the cost of war and the human toll of geopolitical conflicts. The message etched into the wall is clear: the cost of war is always higher than we realize. The continued relevance of the Vietnam War's lessons. Today, the lessons of Vietnam remain as relevant as ever. The war serves as a warning about the dangers of intervention without clear goals, a reminder of how wars can unravel not only nations, but also the very fabric of societies. The Vietnam War was a stark example of how political ideologies can fuel wars that cost millions of lives and leave deep, lasting scars on the nations involved. In the years since, American military engagements have often been shaped by the fears of repeating the mistakes of Vietnam. The legacy of Vietnam has informed subsequent military strategies, leading to the concept of limited wars, where the objectives are narrowly defined to avoid the overextension that characterized Vietnam. The Cold War itself was influenced by the lessons of Vietnam, with the U.S. more cautious in its dealings with countries caught in ideological battles between communism and democracy. Looking at Vietnam through a modern lens. In today's world, the Vietnam War has taken on a new life in historical discussions, documentaries, films, and books. Modern interpretations continue to uncover the complexities of the conflict, revealing the multifaceted nature of the war and its long-term effects on both the U.S. and Vietnam. For Vietnam, the war was a defining moment that not only led to its reunification under communist rule but also shaped the nation's modern identity. After decades of hardship, Vietnam has made significant strides in rebuilding its economy and infrastructure. Yet the war's legacy remains deeply embedded in the cultural and historical consciousness of the country. In the U.S., the Vietnam War is still the subject of intense debate and reflection. Public opinion about the war has shifted over time, and many now view it as a costly mistake. However, the war remains a complex issue, with differing views on the nature of the conflict and the reasons behind U.S. involvement. The Vietnam War serves as an important lesson in humility and the importance of questioning government decisions in times of war. The impact on international relations and the global balance of power. On the global stage, the Vietnam War had a far-reaching impact on international relations. It affected U.S. alliances, influenced global views on democracy, and even changed the way superpowers interacted with one another. The war prompted the U.S. to rethink its role in world politics and the effectiveness of its military might. The failure in Vietnam emboldened some nations to question the U.S. commitment to its foreign policies, leading to shifts in international alliances and perceptions. The war also gave rise to a new era of détente during the Cold War, where both the U.S. and the Soviet Union began to explore the possibility of avoiding direct confrontation, recognizing the devastating effects that a global conflict could have. The lessons of Vietnam made leaders on both sides of the Iron Curtain more cautious about military intervention in places where the ideological battle between communism and capitalism was at its most heated. The legacy of Vietnam is perhaps most clearly seen in the wars of the modern era. The U.S. involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as conflicts in Syria and Libya, have often been compared to Vietnam in terms of unforeseen consequences, protracted conflicts, and the struggle to win hearts and minds. The American experience in Vietnam showed that military superiority alone was not enough to secure a victory in unconventional wars, where the enemy doesn't fight by traditional rules of engagement. As we look at current events, the lessons of the Vietnam War remain central to understanding the complexities of modern warfare. They remind us that in any military intervention, it is critical to clearly define objectives, understand the local culture and terrain, and always have a plan for what comes next. After the initial conflict is over. Outro. A war that still shapes our world. The Vietnam War's reverberations are still felt today. Whether in the way we approach global conflicts, in the debates over military interventions, or in the way we remember those who served, the war has had a lasting impact on how we understand the cost of war. It serves as a powerful reminder that the decisions we make on the world stage have consequences, not just for those involved, but for generations to come. The Vietnam War was more than just a historical event. It was a turning point in the history of both the United States and the world. It challenged the ideals of freedom, democracy, and interventionism, and reshaped our understanding of what it means to be engaged in war. As we look to the future, we must remember the lessons of Vietnam and ask ourselves, how can we avoid repeating the same mistakes in today's global conflicts? What do we owe to the people who served in Vietnam and to those who continue to be impacted by the war's consequences? Vietnam War, a journey through history and its lasting legacy, extended. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the Vietnam War's lasting legacy. Before we conclude, let's take a deeper look into some fascinating stories and lesser-known facts that highlight the profound and complex impact this war had, not just on Vietnam and the U.S., but on the entire world. Some of these stories may surprise you as they reveal the full scope of this conflict, both its horrors and the resilience of the people caught in its crossfire. The echoes of the war, unseen. Stories of the Vietnam War veterans. When we think of the Vietnam War, we often think about the big battles, the Tet Offensive, the fall of Saigon, and the infamous My Lai Massacre. But behind these events lie the untold stories of the veterans who served in Vietnam. Many came back with invisible scars, not just physical wounds, but emotional and psychological trauma that lasted a lifetime. One such story is that of Chuck Hagel, a U.S. Senator and Vietnam War veteran, who later became the U.S. Secretary of Defense. Hagel served in the Army in Vietnam and saw firsthand the brutality of the war. He later reflected on how the war shaped his views on foreign policy and military interventions. His experiences in Vietnam made him particularly cautious about U.S. military involvement abroad, especially in regions where the stakes were unclear and the enemy was elusive. Hagel's story is one of many, and it serves as a powerful reminder of the personal cost of war, not just for the soldiers, but for their families and the world at large. The fall of Saigon, a city in ruins and a nation in transition. The fall of Saigon in April 1975 remains one of the most poignant moments in the Vietnam War. On that day, the Communist forces of North Vietnam captured the capital of South Vietnam, signaling the official end of the war. But what most people don't know is just how chaotic and desperate that moment was for both the Vietnamese civilians and the American diplomats trying to evacuate. The American embassy in Saigon became a symbol of desperation as helicopters took off from its rooftop, evacuating as many American personnel and South Vietnamese allies as they could. In fact, the image of helicopters leaving the embassy during the final days of Saigon's fall became one of the most iconic and haunting symbols of the war. Yet, for many South Vietnamese, the fall of Saigon marked the beginning of a different battle, a battle for survival under the new communist regime. Many tried to flee by boat, creating a harrowing exodus that became known as the Boat People. These refugees faced not just perilous seas, but also the uncertainty of life in a new land, often facing rejection and hardship in countries that were unwilling to welcome them. The Vietnam War and American public opinion. The turning tide. The Vietnam War is also a case study in how public opinion can shape the course of a conflict. At the beginning of the war, the American public largely supported the intervention, seeing it as a way to prevent the spread of communism and support a democracy in Southeast Asia. However, as the war dragged on and the casualties mounted, support began to wane. One of the key turning points in public opinion came in 1968 when the Tet Offensive, a surprise attack by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces, shattered the belief that victory was imminent. Although the offensive was a military failure for the North, it was a psychological victory. The images of the destruction, along with the media coverage that followed, made it clear to the American public that the war was not going as promised. Walter Cronkite, one of the most trusted journalists of the time, famously declared after the Tet Offensive, "I am not sure we can win this war." This was a seismic moment in American history, as the voice of authority and trust began to question the government's narrative. The growing anti-war protests across the United States were fueled by the stories of the atrocities committed, such as the My Lai Massacre, where hundreds of Vietnamese civilians were killed by American soldiers. These protests became a defining feature of American society during the 1960s and 1970s, and they eventually led to a shift in policy. The end of the draft in 1973 and the eventual withdrawal of U.S. troops from Vietnam in 1975 were the results of years of mounting public pressure and anti-war sentiment. The war had left an indelible mark on the American psyche, one that continues to influence U.S. foreign policy to this day. The legacy of the war on Vietnam, healing and rebuilding. While the war's effects on the United States were profound, the impact on Vietnam was even more devastating. Millions of lives were lost, and the country was left in ruins. After the war, Vietnam faced the colossal task of rebuilding its economy and infrastructure, which had been destroyed during decades of conflict. The communist government embarked on an ambitious plan of reconstruction, but the scars of war, both physical and psychological, remained. It wasn't until the 1990s that the world began to see Vietnam emerge as a nation on the path to recovery. One of the most fascinating aspects of the post-war era is the country's transition to economic reforms. In the mid-1980s, Vietnam adopted a series of economic reforms known as Doi Moi, which opened up the country to market-oriented policies and eventually led to rapid economic growth. The resilience of the Vietnamese people in the face of such destruction is a testament to their strength and determination. Today, Vietnam is one of the fastest growing economies in Asia, though it still carries the wounds of its past. The legacy of the war remains visible in the form of unexploded ordnance, UXO, scattered throughout the countryside and in the memories of the older generations who lived through it. Reflections on the Vietnam War. Lessons for today. As we reflect on the Vietnam War, it's clear that its lessons are not just historical, they are timeless. The war teaches us about the dangers of underestimating the enemy, the importance of clear objectives in military conflicts, and the consequences of misleading the public. It also highlights the human cost of war, the sacrifices made by soldiers, civilians, and families who lived through it, and the long-lasting impact of that trauma. In modern times, many of these lessons are still relevant. Today, U.S. military interventions around the world, such as in the Middle East, often raise the same questions that were asked during the Vietnam War. Is the objective worth the cost? What happens after the fighting ends? The Vietnam War serves as a powerful reminder of how these questions must always be answered before engaging in any conflict. Final thoughts. Could history repeat itself? And now, as we conclude this journey, we come back to the question, could history repeat itself? Given the current state of global politics and the complex challenges facing the world today, this question is more important than ever. With rising tensions in places like the South China Sea, Ukraine, and the Middle East, the lessons of Vietnam are just as relevant today as they were in the 1970s. As we look back on the Vietnam War and its many lessons, we must ask ourselves, are we truly learning from history, or are we destined to make the same mistakes again? History will continue to unfold, but it's up to us to make sure that we don't repeat the same errors. We owe it to the generations who lived through the Vietnam War and to those who continue to live with its consequences to remember and learn from their stories. Thank you for watching. If you found this journey into the Vietnam War's lasting legacy fascinating, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Let us know in the comments. What do you think? Are we on the verge of repeating the mistakes of Vietnam in today's world? Or have we truly learned the lessons of history?
Goodbye.